So I think we should mention here again that this documentary never came out. I mean, this is like, let's be clear here about how much effort went into this. They sent a guy undercover for months and months and months and months, got incredibly incriminating footage on some of the scummiest people in Washington, and then the documentary was basically nixed.
You can sort of trace, there's like a single article that's kind of the beginning of like all of the that sort of sets off the chain of events that will lead to the reasons for this documentary getting spiked. And it was published in a little Jewish media concern called Tablet.
Hold on. Young Chomsky, hit me with the noise.
Yeah, this is a friend of the pod, right?
Armin Rosen.
He's tweeted at us a couple times, I think.
He has called this pod, even though, so to be clear, little background on the person who started this whole snowball of this documentary getting canceled. He once paid $137 for a $25 ticket to get in to see the podcast Chapo Trap House featuring TrueAnon podcast at some, I can't remember the venue's name, even though I live in the city that it is in. So that is, I'm not a huge percentages guy, but 25 is a lot less money than 137. And so I ask you, Armin, what kind of Jew are you, Armin? What kind of Jew are you? Anyway, so yeah, Noah, tell me about this article.
Well, so he publishes an article and the headline is Pro-Israel Hoaxer Hits DC. And it basically describes and says it says that like there was apparently an Al Jazeera, like, so this article comes out, by the way, on the day of Donald Trump's inauguration. But it basically says that, you know, it doxes, or rather it blows Tony's cover. And by this point, the United Kingdom lobby episode has aired, and that aired in the UK and had like its own like massive ripple effect over there.
Yeah, it was like mentioned in Parliament. Boris Johnson got mad about it.
Oh yeah. And because an Israeli official was seen was caught on camera saying we got to get rid of the foreign minister of the UK, who was a Tory, because he's not sufficiently pro-Israel. Which was a really terrific cell phone. But so when that came out, they used footage from Tony's time in DC, and it quickly came out in Tablet that like, oh shit, everybody in DC is like shitting their pants, at least in these pro-Israel circles, because this very charming guy came out and threw a lot of parties and talked to a lot of people. And it sort of like begins to set in motion this kind of turmoil about, well, what was it that this guy found out about the Israel lobby, or what was the story that they were going to tell, and who might that be bad news for?
It's interesting that this article came out on the day of Trump's inauguration, because it really sort of sets in motion the Israel lobby itself's sort of plan for dealing with the revelations that are revealed here. I said revelations revealed. My bad. Let's just keep rolling. Because it just in line with how they react to it later, it's essentially they're trying to cause as few waves as possible, to draw as little attention as possible to the even existence of this documentary, let alone what it shows. So we don't hear anything for several months, and around this time, in about June of 2017, one of the worst things in my life happens. I hate it when the Players Club has a bit of a tiff. But do you guys remember when Saudi Arabia and the UAE, all out of seemingly, if you're paying attention to the media, out of nowhere, blockaded the teeny state of Qatar? So to be clear, all these states are on the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia is the biggest one, and UAE is not. They're certainly not as big as Saudi Arabia. Qatar is the smallest one. Qatar has about 2 million people in it. I have no idea what the breakdown between basically servants and Qataris are there, but there are definitely way more basically foreign laborers working, sometimes under very bad conditions, in Qatar than there are actual Qataris. And it's a small country that kind of comes up like a vestigial tail the east coast of the peninsula. It is very small. At one point, Saudi Arabia actually planned to blockade it or to isolate it by building a canal across its border to literally cut it, to actually, like, straight up Bugs Bunny style, cut it off of the entire peninsula. Which is, I mean, a nefarious plan, but extremely funny.
So we should say that right before the blockade started, that there was a big leak of emails to The Intercept from the Emirati ambassador. And this is what's really funny, is that in the emails, he's discussing our old friends from the documentary, the FGD. And it basically, it sounds like they're kind of, I mean, what happens is that, one of the demands in not blockading Qatar was that we need them to shut down Al Jazeera, and in particular, Al Jazeera operations aimed at, quote, defaming pro-Israel groups. So there seems to be a little funny timeline happening here.
Well, it's really strange too, because I think a lot of people just sort of have this blanket assumption that because, Saudi Arabia, UAE, even Qatar, etc., all these states have Arab leaders, that they are naturally basically 100% pro-Palestine, absolutely against Israel. I mean, to be clear, there was a time when if you were Jewish, you were not allowed to go to Saudi Arabia, even if you weren't Israeli. I think it's still technically a law in the books that if you have an Israeli stamp in your passport that you can't get into Saudi Arabia. But that is not the case anymore. And it seems like basically all of the Gulf states have essentially been jockeying to see who is basically most favored when it comes to relations with Israel.
Right. And in this case, part of what was so sort of, I mean, just to give an example, a couple of years ago when I went to the APAC policy conference, like their big annual gala in DC, they the leader of a very influential American Jewish organization I saw got up, and among the first things out of his mouth was him talking about how, in a room full of thousands of people, about how he had just taken this trip to this incredible enlightened nation of the United Arab Emirates, and that the Emiratis were sort of modeling a kind of Arab government that we could work with. And it's because, underneath the hood, while Israel doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with any of these countries, Israel is working hand in glove with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on a wide variety of, issues, largely, most importantly, trying to figure out how to, contain Iran, who is, their, chief regional rival. And Qatar has, got caught kind of in the crossfire of that.
Yeah, the Qataris and the Saudis do not get along for a variety of reasons, some of which I understand, some of which I do not understand. I mean, both of them are essentially similar in many respects. They are both hereditary monarchies, although Saudi Arabia, I got to say, the line of succession there got a little wonky in recent years. I'm not really sure exactly how that's playing out, but hey, what do I look like? One of those guys who draws the fucking coats of arms in England for the rich people? I don't know. I'm not that guy. But they both sell a ton of oil to the West. The problem is Qatar, I think, is doing almost better in some respects with how much they're basically rationing their oil or selling their oil. Again, not an oil man, I don't know. But there were rumblings that maybe one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia was essentially trying to gin up problems with Qatar is so that they might have a pretext for invasion, which could lead to them essentially seizing, of course, all their oil supplies. I'm sure they would install some puppet monarchy or whatever, and their entire, many hundreds of $1 billion worth sovereign wealth fund.
And Qatar, because of this huge schism with the Saudi Arabia, they sort of started engaging in their own campaign, and this is all in the months after this documentary is done being it's like they've done the reporting work, or they're either in the process of making it or they have made it and it just hasn't come out yet. But as that's unfolding, the government of Qatar is sort of trying to figure out okay, how do we either end this blockade? Like, what is it that we can do to improve our position at least with the United States, which is of course the only like country that has the power to like, jerk the strings of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Qatar's like, new enemies.
So Qatar did the same thing that I do whenever some insane person with a dog avatar says that I'm anti-Semitic on Twitter. They invite the worst, most insane right-wing Jews over to their kingdom to have a series of chats. And now, the people they invite is a who's of alleged blank blanks. We've got Malcolm Henla. I don't know how to pronounce this fucking guy's name.
Homeland.
No, you go through these assholes. You know all these motherfuckers.
Well, so like Qatar had invited like Dershowitz, Malcolm Hoenlein, who's like a major domo in the American Jewish community. Jack Rosen from the American Jewish Congress. Really more Klein, Dershowitz, and Hoenlein are like the big names here. And those are like, that's part of the charm offensive that they had brought. Like, whereas the UAE and Saudi had paid for their own, like, junkets of different American Jewish leaders. But like, they're these the elements of the pro-Israel lobby are working, they're working overtime, I guess, to try and figure out, or rather, they're working overtime as, agents for the Israeli government's interests, sort of figuring out, like, between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, like, where the best hand for them lies. Like, who can be the greatest assets for them.
At the same time, they hire this guy, Nick Muzzin, who's like a former aide to Ted Cruz, sort of like mid-wig, not necessarily big-wig Washington lobbyist, who, when I was researching this guy, I found a series of basically incomprehensible articles because I was very tired and had trouble comprehending anything in the first place about various schemes and scams this little scumbag had inserted himself to. But let me tell you, one of his biggest jobs before getting hired by Qatar was that he was working as a registered foreign agent for the Albanian Democratic Party, who, it might shock you to find out, they are Albanian, but they are not very democratic and have a series of I hate to bring up the guy's name again, but Bugs Bunny like scandals and schemes that they've gotten themselves into on the Albania actually, to be completely honest with you, is kind of like the Qatar of the Balkans. It's a little strip of land much smaller than the other ones that it's different. But they hire this guy, and this guy is going around telling everybody, don't worry. I'll make sure that this documentary doesn't rear its ugly head.
And it's like, it even went up past the pay grade of this guy, at least according to some other reports. It started, the documentary as like I guess it went all the way to the top, so to speak.
No. According to a report, and I think 972, a report that I believe Rex Tillerson actually brought this up to the Emir of Qatar and was like, do not let this documentary come out.
Sorry, that's Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, to be
correct.
And the
former CEO
of ExxonMobil.
Exactly. Who you might surprise our listeners, but ExxonMobil has a bit of a Qatar connection, considering that they have a tendril company in that country. I was astounded to find out The Intercept did some really good reporting on this whole saga, much of what we've talked about so far, but that Tillerson's sort of dealings with Qatar during the blockade crisis might be the actual reason that Tillerson was booted out. Because while Tillerson was in Qatar trying to sort of, smooth ruffled feathers and trying to lift the blockade and get this crisis sort of resolved, Trump was like, I think this surprised a lot of people, how Trump was going fucking ham on Qatar for like a month. Like, he was talking about Qatar in speeches. He was calling them like one of the lead sponsors of terrorism. It was pretty astounding because one doesn't get the impression that Trump is entirely familiar with the workings of that small peninsular nation.
I think one of the pretty wild things, at least to me, that sort of like stuck out from like the response to the lobby as well, was sort of how quickly people began targeting Al Jazeera specifically.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they said about Al Jazeera is that it was a hate network, a terror factory, and so on, which felt like, like Ted Cruz and a bunch of other people like signed some stupid letter. But I guess what's kind of wild to me is that that's actually the exact thing that's described in the like lobby documentary, which is that these activists proudly say themselves, which is that, the way that like you defeat your opponent isn't by like addressing any of the facts of the case. It's by saying that they hate Jews and that they're terrorists. And that's immediately what they started getting US senators to say about Al Jazeera in order to nip this in the bud. And they were pushing to get Al Jazeera to be forced to register as a foreign agent representing the government of Qatar.
Yeah, I thought that was astounding because they basically flipped the script on Al Jazeera. And of course, if Al Jazeera, like correspondents or producers, whatever, did have to register as foreign agents in America, they would, of course, be blocked from a lot of the things that they would normally have access to being agents of the press. It's astounding. And at one point, Electronic Intifada reports that America threatened to remove their airbase from Qatar basically over this movie, that say like, if you let this movie come out, we will take our troops out of the airbase. And sort of the subtext there is that if we take our troops out, Saudi Arabian military will roll on through. And to be completely honest with you, if you look up on Live Leaks footage of Saudi Arabian armored columns and motorized troops in Yemen, I have no doubt that about 500 well-trained commandos could take out the entire Saudi Arabian army. However, if Qatar wants to talk to me about that on a financial level, Well,
the irony is that it actually would be our troops coming in from the Saudi forces.
Yeah. Well, at least Blackwater. Yes, correct.
Exactly. Well, I think too, like, it's not just that, so they, it's like smearing everyone as terrorists, but they also like, they did acknowledge that the documentary had been leaked, and they basically said, they're like, don't watch it. You're not going to learn anything. It's boring. There's nothing in here. And like the response from the media was total compliance. Like there was been in the UK, at least, it really was covered in a lot of the papers and on the BBC. And like we mentioned before in Parliament, but like, no one in America was reporting on anything that was in this documentary. And there's quite a lot.
Why do you think that is, Noah? You know a lot more about this stuff than I do.
I would say
you got that blue check inside track.
Well, when I put my fingers to my temples and like become one with my blue check, what it tells me is that the American media like has a really, really substantial blind spot when it comes to Palestine. A lot of it is rooted in, I think, just like pretty basic, like anti-Muslim, anti-Arab bigotry. And like that's a sort of like kind of base explanation that you can give for a lot of why like footage of, it explains why MSNBC will show footage from the aftermath of a stabbing attack in Tel Aviv, but will not show the footage of, like a far more routine occurrence, which is an IDF soldier shooting a Palestinian dead. And I think that like that explains some of it. And then the other part of it though is that, and I think that this is perhaps like a more, and then another explanation is that, there are probably some journalists who bought the Israel lobby's line and said like, like they were like, when they asked questions about it, they were like, listen, don't worry about it. And they took their word for it. But what I think is probably the most likely and the biggest explanation for this particular story, or at least one that has an outsized impact, is that so much of what is revealed in this documentary is like fairly oxygenated to media and Washington types. A lot of them would look at a lot of the conversations in this, and they would look at a lot of the kinds of people that are talking, and they would see the things that they say, and they would say, that's really interesting. I kind of already knew that though. And
Yeah.
they don't take that as an indictment of the system in which they work. They take that as evidence of how banal the facts are in this movie. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Because the thing is that there is no recorded testimony of these kinds of things, even if it's such a, widely felt sentiment. There isn't the kind of frankness, even if this reporter or somebody imagines there to be. I think that there is something really important to be said for the fact that this documentary does a lot to just put people in front of a camera in an environment in which they never get to speak before cameras. And so a kind of conversation that only ever really happens behind closed doors, or at least in some very private rooms, it comes out into the open. And because a lot of the people who report on these spaces, and that's not to say that they're evil reporters or sinister people, but just because they're so embedded in these systems that they may not recognize it. And I think that that's a really sad kind of tragic thing that a lot of media class types have to live with, especially when it comes to Israel-Palestine, is that the horror and the misdeeds and the epic failure and incompetence and the scheming, all of it, it resides in plain view. They just don't do anything about it.